So we're going to go ahead and get started with our final session of this conference, Fitting the Mind to the Brain, Deliberations on Cognitive Ontology. And given that it's a bit late in the day, we need a really strong anchor talk to see us through the exhaustion that's starting to set in pre-pizza. And it's a treat for us that we've got Colin Klein on the other end of this machine here. A couple things I'll say about Colin Klein. For one, he's a co-organizer of this conference and is someone who's worked on this topic a lot and has done a lot to make this event happen, giving a lot of advice from afar, even though he wasn't able to make it. And so it was great having Colin at my side as I planned the conference. Colin Klein is a professor of philosophy at Australia National University. He's also an Australia Research Council Future Fellow, and is currently the director of the Center for Philosophy of Science at Australia National University, which is one of these philosophy of science centers that brings in people from all around the world. Colin has worked on a number of topics in philosophy of mind and neuroscience, which I'll mention a few of here. He's recently collaborated with a scientist to offer a theory of insect consciousness. He has written a book on what pain is, what the body commands, an imperative theory of pain. And he's written extensively about the inferences that we draw from neuroimaging experiments on the topic of whether we should revise our cognitive ontologies or whether network approaches will solve the problems associated, say, with reverse inference. And he has also written about the problem of using neuroimaging to detect residual consciousness in patient populations, so recent critique of Adrian Owen's work, and just many, many more things. So he's an incredibly active and influential philosopher of neuroscience, and we're very lucky to have him speaking about computation plus representational structure equals cognition.
All right. So thanks very much, Joe. And some thanks, thanks especially to Joe McCaffrey, Emily Prochitko, and Ben Henke for organizing all of this. Joe was very kind, although I'm listed as an organizer, I really did not do as much as them. It's a fantastic conference and they should really get a lot of the credit. I also wanted to thank the Templeton Foundation, and particularly the money that comes to this via SNAP, the Summer School in Neuroscience and Philosophy. A lot of this came out of discussions at the SNAP I was at in 2017. It's really a fantastic program. This is Philippe Desbrigard and Walter Sinnott-Armstrong who are putting this together now. I just think it's one of the best things going. I really wish there had been something like that when I was a lad. So so this is great. I've heard the rest of the conference was super. Hopefully I won't drag the tone down too much. So I wanted to start, I've got a specific case I'm going to talk about, but I wanted to start by giving some broad background about why I'm interested in it and how I've been thinking about these things more generally. So the title of the talk is a takeoff of this old textbook by Nicholas Wirth called Algorithms plus Data Structures equals Programs. It's a kind of like Knuth's Art of Computer Programming, a lot of discussion of different algorithms you can use. But one of the focuses that Wirth has that I think is really interesting is that you can't really talk about algorithms in the computer science sense without talking about the kinds of data structures you have available. And that's just to be, and I think in thinking about philosophy of neuroscience, this is one thing I'll try to develop today, it's both a conceptual and an empirical point. So there's a conceptual point because in some sense, processes and what they act on are intertwined. And there's an empirical point because determining how many things there are in some sense requires answering questions of format. And that's going to be in large part the focus of today's talk and the kind of take-home message, which I'll get to. But as a bit of background, I wanted to say why I think this is a really interesting question and an interesting point to make. So some of it is quite general, just to self-plug a paper of mine that just came out in Biology and Philosophy, is partly thinking about mechanism and thinking about a very general question about resources. So a lot of the work in the Neo-Mechanist program, including, which is a WashU special, has focused, and rightly so I think, on parts of objects and the activities they undergo. So the things that do stuff like the piston or the spark plug. But there's an equally kind of important question are an equally important division about what we might call resources. So there are things that get used up, like the air and the gasoline. And one way to think about this is there's something like, within mechanistic explanations, there's a kind of agent-patient distinction. So there's the stuff that does things and the stuff that gets done too. And they have, although they're both part of mechanistic explanations, they have importantly different properties. So for example, resources can be competed for in a way that parts often aren't. There's a lot to say about that. There's a paper about it if anyone's interested. But one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is I think you get a similar and potentially fruitful correspondence in thinking about computation. So you've got, on the one hand, the kind of processes that a computer undergoes, and on the other hand, the particular data structures that it's operating on. And that makes a big difference to certain kinds of things. So, I mean, again, there's a conceptual point. There's this kind of data structures and primitive operations are usually interdefined. So what a string is defined by certain operations that you can do on a string, and conversely, those operations only make sense as defined on a particular kind of structure. But those in turn determine questions about complexity. So how many resources like time and space an algorithm is going to use, and also how long something's going to take, which is of course very important when you start thinking about brains. So as a broader picture, the project I've been thinking about for a while that I've been calling, for lack of a better term, new empiricism. If anyone's got a better idea about this, feel free to email me. But this is, so to throw up two people here, on the top is Andy Barron at Macquarie. He's an insect neuroscientist that I've been collaborating with a lot. And then below is Dan Bernstein from Tulane, who's currently visiting here. And I've had conversations about this with other people as well, but these two guys I've been really inspired by. So I think here's a very broad question. As many of you know, and as I'm sure has come up in the conference, there's this question about how to characterize the function of a brain region. Well, one very broad thing that you might say about it is to say the best way to characterize a brain region just is its learning function. So there's no, when we put this, what we do when we explain is we say, look, there's a certain kind of learning that the brain region does. The explanatory parameters are just what the input is, and then in particular, the kinds of data structures that it learns. So if you've got a story like that, and then the claim is, and this is quite ambitious, and I'm not going to try to fully defend it here, is that if you've got this, you don't need as much innate knowledge as you might think. Maybe you don't need any innate knowledge at all. So Andy has done work on this with instincts, and showing how you can very rapidly learn things that look like instinctive behavior through mechanisms like this. I was inspired in particular, and I want to plug this just because I'm not sure, I think a lot of philosophers haven't come across this, I'm not sure on the science side. There's a lovely paper, or not, it's a paper, it's really a blog post. This is by Peter Norvig, he's the head of research at Google, called On Chomsky and the Two Cultures of Statistical Learning. So there's a potted story you teach in kind of, philosophy psychology classes that people were behaviorists, and then Chomsky came along and said, well, look, syntactic structure can't be learned via statistical learning. And so in particular, you can't learn a syntax using just finite Markov chain models. So Norvig has this paper, and he says, well, there's this funny thing, which is that statistical language models are super successful. Like, all of the, Google uses them all the time. All of the speech recognition software uses this. All of the machine translation software uses this. And this was written about 10 years ago. And so this has just gotten better and more true. He says, well, what Chomsky shows us, this is Norvig's argument, is that you can't learn syntax with a finite Markov chain model. Sure, that's just a reason. And this is one where, you're kind of trying to learn statistical dependencies between a word and like the words that immediately precede it. They said, well, that's just a problem in some sense, this is my translation of it, of structure. So if you learn things, if the learning is defined over things like, I think he likes probabilistic context-free grammars, but if you do something like tree structures, for example, you can learn surprisingly effectively. And you look at things like AlphaGo, or a lot of the, well, AlphaGo is a good example. So if you just tried to learn Go by learning kind of, board positions and statistical facts about board positions, you never even get enough instances to make it worth it. Well, what AlphaGo does is in part do reinforcement learning over things like policies. So it's trying to learn the policies that are most effective in certain circumstances, and that turns out to generalize quite well. So in general, obviously to get these kinds of arguments off the ground, you have to think more about what it means to translate something like a data structure in computer science into something like philosophy of neuroscience. And that's that's kind of what I'm going to be interested in today. So that insofar as there's an argument and a take-home message, it's going to be that questions about the number of processes involved in something often cannot be separated from the question of the format of the representations upon which the processes operate. Now, the often is in there as a kind of hedge. I think there's this potentially misleading bit in the cognitive ontology literature, which is certainly something I've said, that you can find cases where a number of processes can be separated from this. And this is most often in the case in neuropsychology. To me, like neuropsychology, you get a double dissociation. You know that there are two processes quite independent of what those processes are doing or what they operate on. Or that's a standard story. And maybe, maybe that happens sometimes. But that it can be done generally is, I think, an open question. And I've started to think that, in fact, these questions are too intertwined in most cases. Now, hopefully some of you believe something like this already, or at least sounds plausible, which is great. Hopefully it doesn't sound trivial. What I'd like to do is work through an example, and I'd like to work through it using a case that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that's of peripersonal space. So as an introduction, here's a lovely old bit from the artist Marina Abramovich and her partner Ule, a piece called Rest Energy. Now, it's an actual bow and arrow. So one of the things I love about this, it makes very vivid. There's this sense of the space around Abramovich's body and how it's threatened by the arrow. So it's very close to her. It represents a real danger, and you can palpably feel that. And there's also a sense in which there's a space around Ule's body which is not threatened, and also in some sense extended. So something like the arrow becomes an extension of his hand. Now, in the original, which you couldn't hear in this, Abramovich is also mic'd for sound for her heartbeat, so you can tell that she gets, it's quite an intense and quite fearful experience. So the experience of threat is not in an abstract way. There's some close connection between that space around the body and the feeling of threat. And more broadly, although we'll talk about this more today, there's also a certain intimacy to it. And you might think work on the emotions of, and particularly intimacy. Letting someone into personal space is often the kind of clear sign of an intimate relationship. So you encapsulate a lot of stuff, and it all seems to be centered around the space around the body. And this is sometimes called peripersonal space. I'm going to give, by the way, I took classes from Michael Graziano in grad school. I'm a partisan, so I'm going to give a very Graziano-centric view of peripersonal space. There he is, looking dreamy. So we define peripersonal space very broadly as that portion of space that's kind of immediately around the body, roughly from your skin to the effective reaching distance. That can change, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And there's a lot of good reason to think, just behaviorally, that peripersonal space is really important to us. That's the kind of point of the Abramovich piece, that we recognize certain phenomena that seem to be closely linked with the area around us. There's an interesting question about whether peripersonal space has its own representation in the brain. That may not be true, right? You may just care about space and care about threats, and a lot of the threats happen to happen close to your body, and that's it. So there's been interesting work, and this was done with Graziano and Gross and Yap. So a lot of what I'll talk about is single cell recordings from macaques, mostly in the ventrointraparietal cortex or the premotor zone. So macaques are interesting because there's a lot of work on them. Also, they do use something like tools. Here they are smashing open some kind of shellfish, I think, on the beach. So they're rather clever, and they seem to do certain things that are important for peripersonal space. So some of the original findings, this is Graziano, Yap, and Gross in '94. was that you had neurons with bimodal receptive properties. So they responded both to touch, but also to vision. And in an interesting way. So in figure B, I think this is all premotor zone. That's what A is supposed to show. In figure B, you might have a macaque where they find a receptive field that it's on the face, but will also respond to visual stuff in a kind of cone outward from that patch of skin on the face. There are also ones that seem to be anchored, for example, to the limbs or to the hands. And the interesting thing about that is, as the hand moves, the visual receptive field also moves to attempt, at least in some cases, to cover where the hand is. Similarly, in B, if the macaque moves its head, the visual receptive field moves with the patch of skin. So you get these neurons that seem to have these bimodal and later sometimes trimodal properties. So some of them will respond to sounds. It's actually pretty cool. Some of the sound stuff, it will respond to sounds that are close to the face, regardless of the sound intensity. So there's clearly, it's processing some kind of localized sound stimuli as well. They also, at least some of them, seem to respond to the properties of the object. So looming, or objects moving towards, which of course are going to be threatening objects, give a much more vigorous response than objects moving away. Brasiano reports stuff with using an apple versus a fake snake, and the fake snake gives a much more vigorous response as well. So the picture, well, and I should say, so you've got these bimodal receptive neurons that can be on various points of the body. The receptive fields seem to be denser and more overlapping close to the body, with only a few going further out. So it seems like the space around closer to the body is much better represented. And the other interesting thing is that, at least for some of these, if they're stimulated, so if the neurons, this is mostly premotor zone, if they're stimulated, they tend to evoke a very stereotypical defensive posture that's oriented towards the portion of space that's monitored. So if you've got one, say this is a bimodal neuron around the eye, and you stimulate it, what you get is an evoked posture that's a kind of protective gesture towards the eye. Apparently they look pretty much like natural defensive postures. So it looks like these areas are monitoring things that are threat relevant near the body, and also responsible for motor actions to ameliorate those threats. Now, there's also, where this is mostly out of Ariki's lab, this is from a nice review from 2004, that insofar as you have these neurons, they also, the properties of their receptive fields also seem to be altered by tool use. So there's a lot of work with macaques and giving them rakes to pull bits of food towards them. So, here are two cases where it looks like using a tool tends to extend out what looks like the representation of peripersonal space to cover the area represented by the tool. And this involves, on the top one on D, or C and D note, the macaque actually has to use the tool. So just holding an object won't do it. There's something about tool use that extends the representation of peripersonal space out. So pretty interesting stuff. There's, some people and some philosophers have thought there's an interesting phenomenology to this as well. As a final note, just about other distortions of this work out of Sambo and Ianetti. This is looking at in humans. There's less work in humans because single cell recording's hard. But in terms of what's called the hand blink reflex. So if your hand is close to your face and you give tactile stimulation of the hand, you'll blink. Which is probably some kind of defensive reflex, and the further away it is, the less likely you are to blink and the less strong it will be. So it did interesting stuff showing that this happens, but also that it's modulated by trait anxiety. So in general, the more anxious you are, it seems like one way to read this, as they do, is that the kind of barrier that you're defensive about extends further out from the body. So it seems like you can get these modulations of peripersonal space, both by tool use and by things like anxiety, which again, is pretty cool. So all of this suggests that there is something interesting going on with a representation that's at least partly specific for peripersonal space, has interesting properties. And then there's a question about how many representations there are. And I'm going to suggest, just to sort of give a preview, I'm going to suggest that this generates a puzzle and that the ultimate solution to the puzzle depends on how you think about the format of the representations. But before we get there, I want to sort of set it up in the way de Vignemont and Ionetti set it up. Really nice paper on this, going through the evidence. This is from 2014. I should say, Frederic de Vignemont has just come out with a book on representation of the body that's really nice. I definitely recommend it. As well as there's going to be a volume on peripersonal space, which some of this stuff is going to be in. We're going to make a more strident argument. So they point out there are kind of two models, which they call the Swiss Army knife and the specialist model. The real question is whether there's one representation or more than one representation. And the contrast is this. So you might have a kind of general map of peripersonal space that then gets used for defensive actions and for working actions with things like tools. Or you might have two distinct peripersonal space maps, one for defense and one for working with tools. It's an interesting question. This is quite a general question that comes up a lot in the body representation literature, and there's kind of a worry that the body representation literature likes to proliferate maps of the body in order to account for phenomena. So some of the fights over in that literature, at least in philosophy, are how many representations you need. I will say, I won't talk about it much, but De Vignemont and Ionetti, they ultimately like the two map model and spend some time arguing that you don't need more than two for precisely this reason, because you don't want too many of them. So De Vignemont and Ionetti think that there's good reason to like the specialist model. This is the two map model. So you get different responses. In general, tool use looks very different from defensive actions. They have a different informational grain. So if something's flying at my face, I don't really need to know what it is too much, so long as I know that's on a collision course with my face. That's all I need to know in order to kind of try to block it. Whereas something like trying to pull a bit of food with a rake, I need fairly fine-grained information about where the rake is relative to the food into my body. It looks like they're modulated differently by anxiety. There's not that much about tool use, whereas anxiety obviously extends the peripersonal space case. And then it's also a different relationship to tool use. I think this is an interesting point. So they rely on, it's a nice paper by Povinella et al. This is mostly on chimpanzees, I think, but trying to temper some of the enthusiasm about this idea that peripersonal space and the body image is just extended willy-nilly by tools. They point out, well, one of the things we use tools for, let's say like to stoke the hot embers of a campfire or stir a pot of boiling soup with a wooden spoon. In these cases, we could actually poke the embers of the campfire with our hand, but the tool is, as they say, the tool is chosen as a substitute for the upper limb in order to avoid harm. And these examples suggest that we maintain separate non-isomorphic representations of the hand versus tool as concrete entities, even when using handheld tools within our normal peripersonal space. So part of the point is, one of the nice things about tools is we don't have to defend them like we defend our body, because they're not actually part of our body. So, if your poking stick gets burned, too bad. Much better than your hand getting burned, because your hand you actually care about. So that's all supposed to be arguments for the specialist model and for the idea that we've got two different representations. But in thinking through some of this, I actually think there are a bunch of cases that push the other way. So sometimes you get cases where tool use and defensive activity seem to be really inextricably intertwined. So I was reading up a lot of stuff on flint napping recently. Flint napping turns out to be really, really dangerous for the person doing it. So there are these like modern flint napping seminars where you can learn how to make stone axes. And one of the things is you've got to wear really heavy gloves and eye protection, or sign a really heavy duty waiver, because otherwise you inevitably get cut. In fact, one of the authors on the standard book about like home flint napping cut one of his own tendons so badly that he can't straighten out his finger. It's a dangerous enough activity that Peter Hiscock, who's an archaeologist at University of Sydney, thinks it's really good evidence for a kind of apprenticeship hypothesis and social learning hypothesis, at least as far back as the Acheulean, the Stone Age, because you really need careful guidance and teaching in order to do this without completely destroying your hands. So that's a case where the tool you're using and the problems for your body are very close together, and aside from the sharp bits, you're also hitting it with a hammer. You don't want to hit your thumb. So this seems like there needs to be a really close relationship between tool use and defensive action in these cases. There also are cases where you want to protect your tools, just when they're like, it's very easy if you're a butcher to snap your knife. So you learn a lot of techniques of carving up meat that don't involve it. And I think actually when tools are harder to come by, people are more worried about and more protective of them. There are also more general social coordination stuff. Like I assume part of the thing about using a spear is not just, you got to avoid spearing yourself, obviously, and you want to spear the thing you want, but you can't spear your neighbor, or they don't want to invite you on hunting parties anymore. So insofar as there's a kind of extension of protective space, it seems to be fairly complicated and interact a lot with the kind of tool you're using. And finally, there are cases that just don't seem to fit either, like navigating through a crowd, which is this kind of constant dance of personal space, but also moving your own body in ways that will achieve an end without breaching others' personal space and without your own. So it seems like there's this really tight interrelationship between the two things. So the puzzle then, and this is not like a paradox or anything, there are things you can say on either side to try to account for it, but it seems like there's this initial puzzle that there are good arguments for both a specialist and a Swiss Army knife view. The kind of differential response properties favor the one, interactions favor the other. And it's difficult to know how to adjudicate this. So in talking with David Lamont, I don't know of any like neuropsychological dissociations between the two. Of course, absence of dissociation doesn't show a lot. So the kind of standard techniques we have for this, well, the one easy technique we have for this doesn't give us much. So there's I think a really interesting question about which one you want to favor. So that's the puzzle. I want to turn now to, I think, a really deep point. This is by Brizzoli et al. And so this is stepping back and thinking, okay, so we've got this idea that we might have a map of peripersonal space, but a good question is always, why do we have that map? What's it for? And I think they've got a really nice answer. So this is from a paper of theirs by 2014. They talk about this problem that, different body parts, we have different sources of information, and also our, body parts that we affect can change. So given this, the brain needs to integrate and constantly update information arising in an eye-centered reference frame with information about the current position of the hand relative to the body and nearby potential target objects. And then the peri-hand space, the Kivett hands, representation provides an effective mechanism to support such a fundamental function. So I think this is good. I think the claim here is essentially that really what you want peripersonal space for, or representation of peripersonal space for, is to do something like a complicated coordinate transformation function. Now, coordinate transformation, McCloskey has a nice piece on this. There are a couple different things going on here that aren't often distinguished. So there are really two problems. One is that they talk about the eye-centered reference frame versus a hand-centered reference frame. This is, in one way of reading this, is about the origin of the two reference frames. So your eyes are, well, right now my eyes are up above my head. And translating between two different origins there is complicated because my hands can move, my eyes can move. So there's not a single mapping that's going to work. It's got to integrate a bunch of proprioceptive information. There's a distinct problem, and I think actually the more pressing one, that the kind of, if you think about these as multidimensional representations, the different dimensions, or referred to as the different bases for these representations, take in very different things. So for an eye-centered reference frame, we might have something like, well, either retinal position, or if it's the eye itself, the angle of the eye relative to the face. Whereas for motor coordinates, you might have something like different joint angles as the representational space. So you've got representational spaces that sort of live in two different vector spaces, and you need to figure out a projection that goes from one to the other. And that's, again, a fairly complicated thing. There's no easy mapping. It can be quite a nonlinear mapping. So this kind of coordination function, coordinate transformation function, is really non-trivial, and we need something to do it. Now, I'm going to contrast two different strategies for building up a representation that does that coordinate transformation. The first is going to be what I'll call the strategy of using cartographic bases. So in a cartographic basis, the way you think about peripersonal space representation is roughly like a map. This is certainly in the Divignomont and Leonetti. This is how they have it, right? So they've got two maps, and this is the center bit. The dimensionality of this map is close to the dimensionality of what you're representing. So I'm assuming that these are meant to be maps of three-dimensional space around the body. So at a first pass, they have 3 dimensions. Things are located in the peripersonal space within that map, and there's a fairly simple relationship between the map and the world. So the map's roughly isomorphic to the world in some simple way. And because of that, there doesn't have to be a single way. This is more of a family of bases, or a family of maps. There are a bunch of different ways to represent space, and it depends a lot on your interests. So if anyone's ever geeked out about cartography or read various things about this, I should put in the XKCD. There's a great XKCD about this too. Representing a globe as a map involves various intrinsic trade-offs. So there are different ways to project the surface of a sphere onto a flat plane. And some of these are good for navigation and represent space or area very poorly. Some give you equal area, but are less good for navigation and so on. So the way you represent space is still left open, and there may be questions about this in the representation of peripersonal space. But the idea here is, suppose you had to translate now between different maps. You can, but the translations are fairly complicated. If you needed to do a coordinate transformation between like a polar map and a Mercator map, especially if you thought there might be other ones that would come in the meantime, one nice thing you might do is just try to recover the original structure. So you might project your Mercator back to the surface of the globe. I think that's an invertible one. Some of these aren't invertible, but whatever. So you project the Mercator back to the surface of the globe, and then you reconstruct a polar map or vice versa. So the idea is, if you've got complicated coordinate transformations, but you can kind of recover the original space that you're trying to act on, one thing you can do, and this is the cartographic basis strategy, is just have your intermediate representation be like that space. Right. So, and now I think this is an important part of their argument to flesh it out more. So suppose you're doing that. One thing I'll note, and I'll come back to, the transformations back and forth to the globe here are going to be fairly complicated, mathematically speaking. I mean, they're at least nonlinear. So they're fairly complicated, but once you got them on the globe, if you wanted to do things, it's fairly simple. So I think this is what's going on in the cartographic bases, right? So you've got, insofar as you want to distort the map, then that distortion is going to have an effect everything downstream. So that probably looked less dramatic than I wanted it to. Let me go back. So the idea, look on the right, look at the spider getting bigger. Woo! The idea is, if you want to make the spider bigger by distorting the metric properties of the map or something, if you have a general map, you distort everything, and that's going to affect defensive or working action in the wrong ways. So that's a reason to think that you must have two different things, because distortions affect defensive action and working action differently. The kind of crucial premise in that is that the place to do the distortions is not the translation out of the general map, but on the general map itself. And that kind of makes sense, because the general map is supposed to be fairly simple and have properties roughly like the world that you're trying to represent. All right, so all of that's, that's fairly straightforward. I want to contrast that with a different strategy, which is less familiar, I think, to philosophers, but some people in the audience might be more familiar with it. And this is the strategy what I call making a functional basis. So suppose you've got a picture you want to represent, and you're a computer. One thing you could do is what's called a bitmap, where you just pick each point in the picture and represent the color value there. That would be like making a cartographic basis. But a lot of pictures, certainly on computers, so anything in JPEG format, for example, work more like this. So you've got, on the left is what's called the discrete cosine transform. So you've got a bunch of different basis functions. You can think of them as kind of filters that are applied to the overall image. if you're familiar with Fourier analysis or Fourier decomposition, this is a similar strategy. So you've got a bunch of functions, you apply these, and then you represent the picture as a weighted collection of these functions. So this is, in some sense, a vector in a 64-dimensional space. Now, you actually do this for each 8x8 block, I think. So you're going to have a bunch of these. But the idea is you pick these functions, and these are picked not because they resemble the world in any intuitive sense, but for their mathematical properties. Partly because they're easy to translate into this basis, but partly because, although this seems quite complicated, certain operations become very simple. So the reason why this is used in the JPEG standard is something like compression becomes trivially just a matter of throwing out a lot of the higher frequency components. So the way it's set up and the particular bases that are chosen for this are such that in many cases you can throw out a lot of the information and get a picture that looks roughly as good as the original. So that's a very complicated thing to do if you just have a bitmap, whereas using something like the discrete cosine transform and in what general we'll call a functional basis makes it very easy. Other things are harder. So there are trade-offs here in terms of what's easier and harder depending on the kind of representation you have. Now, one thing you might do, and this is a bit of machine learning, so again, apologies for anyone who's already familiar with this, but I think it's a very cool strategy you sometimes get in machine learning. So in the background here, one of the ideas is linearity is really important when you're trying to learn. Learning linear functions is much easier than learning nonlinear functions, and there are many more constraints on them, so there's less of a concern that you're making stuff up. Now, a very standard problem that you get in machine learning is you've got a class of things, here's the blues and the oranges in two-dimensional space, and you want to separate them, so it's a classification problem, but there's no linear boundary that separates them. You could try to learn, a circular boundary, but that's not linear. Here's one strategy that gets used in a variety of ways a lot, and it's a nice animation of this, is to take it and do a nonlinear projection of your data into a three-dimensional space. Now, if you pick the right projection, you note that in that three-dimensional space, there's now a linear plane that separates the two classes. Indeed, if were you to project that back down to the original 2D space, what happens is that counts as a circle. The idea is some problems are linear in a higher number of dimensions, even if they're nonlinear in a lower number of dimensions. So one thing you can do when you've got a complicated problem is project it non-linearly into a higher dimensional space and then have linear learning functions. And you can do this quite generally. So here's another analogy. Suppose I'm doing a bunch of two-dimensional classification problems, and I find out that, or I happen to notice that all of them seem to involve conic sections. So they're very different classification problems, but sometimes the boundary is a circle, sometimes it's a parabola, and so on. With just a little bit more effort, I'll give what I'll call a generic basis here. So I project it into this four-dimensional space, and those show you the functions of the original one. And now, any conic section I want to pull out of my original two-dimensional space is a linear function in that four-dimensional basis. So in other words, I take a bunch of what seem like complicated nonlinear classification problems, and by projecting into the right higher dimensional basis, I get a bunch of linear problems. Now there's a cost. The original projection is nonlinear, and it's going to take more space because I'm projecting into four dimensions, whereas this is all in two. So this kind of representation has trade-offs, but for certain types of things, it's going to be really useful. And the important thing, again, note is that the basis I've picked for this is chosen just for its mathematical properties, not for any intuitive relationship to the way the world is. So we've got two strategies here for representing peripersonal space. I'm going to ask, which one does the brain use? I'm not going to answer that one today, although I'm finishing up a paper on this. Obviously, I'm going to all this work because I think it's the functional bases. But just to give you a quick flavor of it. So there's some nice work. This is older work from Puget and Sanowski, talking about parietal cortex and representation in parietal cortex. This is mostly trying to do modeling work on single cell recordings. There's been variations of this. But the idea is if you pick the right basis functions, you can do something like what I've been calling using a functional basis, and solve a bunch of problems really neatly. So here, I think, what are we using? It's like a sigmoid of eye position and a Gaussian of retinal position. I'll write this down somewhere. One's a sigmoid, one's a Gaussian of retinal and sigmoid of eye position. So you've got these two nonlinear functions. You project them up into a high dimensional space. This is, again, trying to do this coordinate transformation problem where you're trying to go from a head-centered information and retinotopic information and get a useful motor function out of it. So you use these nonlinear basis functions, you make this higher dimensional representation that can capture all of the information. And the nice thing about this is that once you do it, they point out, so although the basis function units, so the core representation, have in some sense multiple frames of reference, but the output units just take linear functions of that, and they extract only the ones needed for behavioral control. So they say, therefore, a given behavior has access to only one frame of reference. The idea here, I take it, is that you can do this higher dimensional representation, and it's got the nice property that, although it's kind of complicated, if you need head-centered coordinates, that's a linear function of it. If you need retinotopic coordinates, that's a linear function of it. If you need other complex combinations of head-centered and retinotopic coordinates, those are also linear functions of it. So you spend time creating a largish and more complicated representation, but you get ease on the output. So the overall picture, just to show it, this is a functional basis for peripersonal space, is you've got stuff being transduced and coming in. You do a bunch of nonlinear basis functions to get them into this complex representation. But then you've got a bunch of linear readouts for action, maybe some for tool use, some for defense, some for other things. Because they're linear functions, they're easy to learn. And also in part because they're linear functions, they're easier to distort. So you just distort the weight on the linear function in systematic ways for the particular thing you care about. So although you have a core representation that's shared by both defense and tool use, you can bias them separately at the readout stage. So you can recapture the behavior now using only one core representation of peripersonal space, which may also be used for other things as well. So just to point out and just to contrast, one reason why there's a puzzle, and the thing you have to answer before you solve it, is that really there are two different strategies for representing peripersonal space the brain might use. One is to use a cartographic basis, and that you've got, in some sense, a simple representation of peripersonal space with relatively complicated transformations to and from that. If you're going to distort that, the distortions are most plausibly done in the base representation, not the more complex readout state functions. And because of that, you need at least two representations to account for tool use and for defensive action. Conversely, if you use a functional basis, you're using one fairly complicated representation. I should say it's complicated. It still carries all the same information, but now it's a higher dimensionality, and what the different dimensions represent don't have the kind of intuitive. But although there's a complex transformation into that basis, there are simple linear readouts from that basis for individual actions. So because of that, the biases are easiest to introduce at the readout stage. And the conclusion is you've only got one representation, but a variety of ways to use them. So all of this is by way of saying, and this is now coming around to a conclusion, back to the take-home message. We've got this initial puzzle about the number of processes that are involved in peripersonal space. But answering that, I think, ultimately can't be separated from a question about the format of the representation upon which the peripersonal space representations act. So that's the conclusion. And now the question, just in the last minute or two, to get back around to thinking about cognitive ontology, a question is, since all of this, and as Joe mentioned, a lot of my original interest in this was in fMRI, there's a question, do we get this kind of thing, or do we need to go do single cell recording? Hopefully we don't have to do single cell recording in humans. On the other hand, I think, I don't have time to talk about it today, there are good reasons to think that a lot of the traditional ways of trying to get information about representational structure out of the brain, so the thing about MVPA and whatnot, don't actually ultimately give you the representational space that the brain uses. Which, if true, is a bit tricky. I think ultimately and unfortunately, the main thing we need in this is better kind of intermediate level computational modeling. So a lot of the promise of fMRI, at least initially, was that we could answer various questions about the number of processes without doing the more detailed computational modeling about what the individual areas were doing. And I think the point we've gotten to is really that computational modeling has become increasingly important and increasingly pressing if we want to answer questions about cognitive ontology. So that's the take-home message. Thanks again to a lot of people for talking to me about this, also the Australian Research Council. There is a book which is partly about peripersonal space and partly to remind me that I should probably write a different book and plug a different book at some point. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Hexam. I'm an anesthesiologist. Is there a dynamic representational process? Sherman and Guillory wrote a book in 2013 on the functional connectivity between the cortex and the thalamus. And my understanding is that he states unequivocally that the conventional way of doing fMRI phrenology doesn't work, and he suggests that you study the constant ghosting, is that the thalamus and all motor centers and the cortex are all immediately connected because of branching axons, so that the spinal thalamic tract branches so that the thalamus is always relaying information to the cortex, where the hand is, where the eye is, and the like. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind about this, but it strikes me as being a dynamic way of addressing this problem rather than my understanding of what you just presented.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the two are in conflict. So it's true that this is a static kind of model. I don't know the Sherman and Guillory. I'll have a look at it, because in general, I mean, Joe mentioned some of my work on working with some insect neuroscientists. In general, I've been really big on subcortical stuff lately. Also, I'm giving a talk about dynamics and representation at the Philosophy of Science Association in like 5 days. So if anyone's interested, and at PSA, I'll be saying a little bit more about this. I mean, I do think that's right. And I do think there's a nice paper that just came out in Synthesa by David Danks and somebody about the problems with doing functional connectivity if you don't take into account the different temporal grain that you might do. So essentially, your functional connectivity measures depend a lot on whether you're measuring, assuming that you can't measure it fast enough to get the like Nyquist-Shannon limit, then it depends a lot on the temporal grain that you've got. So yeah, I mean, I think all of these are really interesting questions. I do think there's still going to be a residual question about the kinds of representations you have for solving these problems, even if you've got even if you move to a kind of more dynamic online process-based representation. So while I do think that's important, I mean, I shouldn't have given the impression I think this is going to solve like every problem in fMRI, or even necessarily any problem in fMRI. But I do think that regardless of whether you're doing a more traditional kind of static view where you've got mostly brain regions and transformations between them, or you're trying to open it up and do a more process-based view, there's going to be serious questions about the format that the representations take in either kind of view.
Hey, Colin, it's Carl.
Hey, Carl.
How you doing, man?
The room must be bigger than I realized. Anyway.
I might be smaller. It's my error signal went way up at the end of your talk, and so I might be missing something. I think, and it's really just about the thesis. When you say that these two things can't be separated, the number of modules that we've got cannot be separated from representational format. There was a way that I expected this to go, and it didn't go that way. So when you say that it cannot be separated, do you mean that we can't, even if we had the single unit recording data, we could not decide the matter until we figured out what representational format was being used? Or are you suggesting that that the representational format makes a difference to how likely it is that it uses one versus two? I'm just not sure what I'm not sure the structure of the argument and what it is that you're trying to argue for.
Okay. Okay, so that's good. It wasn't the first thing you said sounded fairly skeptical, and it's not. I didn't mean it to be a skeptical conclusion. I mean, I actually think there's an answer to this, which is the functional basis strategy. I really like the Chomsky and Piaget model, which is in part built off single cell recordings. So let me step back a second and see if I can say it more precisely. I mean, the conceptual point is supposed to be that a thesis about a computational process is going to come along, in most cases, with a thesis about the kind of representation you're using. So implicitly or explicitly, like in the case of the original puzzle, you can't fully answer the question of how many processes there are without answering the question of how what kind of representation you think those processes are operating over. And conversely, the evidence that you need to adjudicate between them is going to in part depend on the kind of evidence you have about representational structure. Now, I think it's a separate question whether you can get that evidence. I think you can, and this is the sort of more positive point that's not in this. But the initial point was supposed to be that the two are related. And so, well, let me pause there and see if that answers your question. I can certainly say more about it.
That certainly gets at part of it. I mean, part of the question that I had was just, are you making a claim about our discovery, about how we will make this discovery and how our discovery, in our attempt to discover cognitive ontology, we cannot separate these two issues? Or whether you were making a claim about the brain, that how many modules it needs will depend on the representational format that it's using. The latter claim strikes me as correct, and then I was wondering if you were trying to make the first claim or the second claim. That's it.
Wait, so the latter claim sounds correct, because I like the latter one.
Okay.
Sorry, you said the latter claim sounds something.
If the brain uses functional bases, then it's more likely that it's using one. That's the conclusion. If the brain is using functional bases, then it's more likely that it would use one map rather than two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That was the conclusion in the case. So, okay, actually, maybe this is helpful. The first one, I certainly think that, like, as part of the context of discovery, whatever, like, we need to keep these questions in mind, and that's the kind of broader big picture thing. I don't want to say, so it's not so much that I think the brain generally uses functional bases. I think sometimes it uses cartographic bases too. Which is for a particular kind of set of phenomena and set of behaviors. There's a question about which kind of bases are used in that, and more generally, the talk about bases is trying to cash out the analogy for data types. So these might vary across the brain. In fact, it's a kind of important part of the new empiricist picture that one way that you get kind of evolvability and evolution of completely novel functions is you get novel types of representation. So the ability to represent, for example, tree structures or sequential structures or something like that represents a nice leap. So I think there's going to be differences around. The stuff about cartographic and functional bases was all setting up stuff about representations of space in particular, and peripersonal space in particular.
Prevent the possibility that the brain just decided to use the same representation twice, regardless of the format. But like, for instance, it chose functional bases, and it's still using two representations in functional bases. That's still a possibility, right?
Still a possibility, yeah. I mean, some of this was meant to say, well, you don't have to, but I suppose it could turn out that they do. does seem like you could duplicate representations all the time. So that's not obviously ruled out, and that's a good point.
Hey, Colin, Russ Poldrack here.
Hey, Russ, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So, it's hard for me to imagine, I mean, in some ways, neurons are always using functional bases, right? If you look at take visual cortex, right? V1, we know that V1 neurons have these functional bases that, are something like a Gabor, right? But there's also clearly a topographic map there, right? And my guess is that, so I heard you kind of framing it as an either or, but it seems like the natural way that the brain works is to use neurons that, are expressing functional bases, and at least in a lot of cases, do that in a topographic way. So I wonder what you think about that, kind of the mixture of those two.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I was worried a bit about this. There's, on the other end, I don't know, there's a nice paper by Graziano and Aflalo. I think there are two of them trying to get at some of this. And I think, because I think you're right. I mean, in some sense, some of this is trying to introduce functional bases more in the philosophical literature. And really, there's an interesting question about which nonlinear function is used in most cases. Anyway, the Graziano and Aflalo, it's a nice paper. One of the things it suggests is that you get something like a topographic map. This is for motor cortex, but it's a consequence of projecting a high dimensional map back down onto the sheet of cortex. And because you get, with various fairly simple organizational principles, you're going to want things that affect the same muscles, all things being equal, being close to each other. So the nice thing about that is you get something that looks like a topographic organization while still with this sort of more interesting structure in the background. I mean, I wonder about this. I don't know the visual cortex stuff as well. Well, I mean, there's a sense in which, I don't think you're making this mistake. There's a mistake students often make that say, well, let me put it this way. I often start off a part of Philosophy of Mind giving them, who was it, Da Vinci's puzzle about where the retinal image gets flipped back around, because it's upside down on the back of your eye, but we see things right side up. So where does it have to be flipped? And the answer is that's a false, that's a bad question, because the mere fact that something is represented with the representational bits upside down doesn't mean that you see it upside down. And so the fact that something is topographic itself seems to be more something about the way in which cortex organizes itself than like the essential utility of having it topographically mapped. But I feel like I'm starting to ramble here. You might notice a theme. So let me stop there. I mean, that's my initial thought on it. I agree that there do seem things that are topographically mapped on the surface of cortex, but whether they're actually, working as something like a cartographic basis is a separate question.
Right. So what would the criteria be to say that something that is that could show that something that's topographically mapped on cortex is not serving as a cartographic basis?
Yeah. I take it would be something about how it's used downstream. I mean, I think actually, sorry, I'm thinking through the visual cortex case in the first one, because I think that's probably the strongest case, because it does seem like position within V1 gets used, or at least is important further down the line, at least for the first few things. So let's kick that around a little bit more. But yeah, it's going to be something about use. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, recently it's become clear that actually there's retinotopic maps way, farther out than people thought there were. So well into the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Yeah.
Although the interesting thing about the kind of model I was talking about is you can get, I think it's interesting, and it might be interested to get some more references. So the idea of this, the more complicated functional basis, of course, you can still recover retinotopic information. Sorry, so now I'm kind of curious. I mean, what kind of work is giving the retinotopic mappings up into the parietal lobe or whatnot?
This is work, mostly using, there's this idea called population receptive fields where you show stimuli throughout, of different types around the visual system, and then you basically model, the responses, and you say, given the response of this neuron or this voxel to all those different stimuli, what's the most likely, thing that it's representing. So it's basically just showing a bunch of visual stimuli and asking how it responds. And
yeah. Okay. Cool. But this is taking off fMRI data and doing some kind of decoding off of it.
Yeah, it's not necessarily decoding. It's like a linear model, but yeah, that's basically.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so this is nice, right? And this did not show up in it, but on a paper that just came out in Neuroimage about some of these issues, actually about single cell stuff too. But yeah, might be that even if you've got a more complicated representation, if you've got, maybe that it has enough information within that to recover a retinotopic mapping, and even with a fairly simple linear mapping off of that information. So I have to have a look at the actual work and the kind of model choice stuff. But part of the thing was part of the idea was, of course, there's going to be a lot of information, perhaps in different coordinate frames, that can have a linear, can be read off with a linear readout. Just one of the cool features of this kind of model. So just the fact that you can get kind of interesting retinotopic information out at later stages. The question, I guess, is more whether it's solely retinotopic or whether it's represented in a form that lets you get the retinotopic stuff out, but also potentially get other stuff out.
Well, I think that I'm not a vision scientist, but my impression is, at least across the early areas, it's almost like a labeled line representation, right? Where it's like, mapping directly via projections that are retinotopy. So it's not like you're not doing some decoding to get the retinotopy out. The retinotopy is there due to the anatomy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually, it's interesting. I have to think a bit more about the constraint where it's there due to the anatomy, but it's true. That it does seem like early vision is this gets back to what I was saying before. So I guess it's an interesting question. I'll have to have a look at some of this about whether, the retinotopy is getting combined with other stuff, and that's what you're getting in the later ones, which still preserves enough retinotopic information. Because I assume by parietal, you're starting to get multimodal, at least some multimodal stuff in there, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, Colin. Thanks.
Hi, Joe.
Can you hear me? You looked like the screen had frozen. Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so some of, I heard echoes of so when, David Plout and others were writing about, PDP, so there are a couple, papers. One was the like shallow, droughts and intoxicate the brain paper. But the other was the letting structure emerge paper. And so those papers had the idea that in some places, people with a more classical computational architecture were inferring on the basis of dissociations that there must be multiple processes. And, the line they were trying to take is that, kind of in this case, like a single, neural net could, one process could account for what people in the classical framework thought had to be done by multiple processes. So I don't know. I just wanted to point out that there might be a fruitful, like a kind of overarching abstract similarity between what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I had an argument a while back with Max Coldhart about this, because you've got Karamaza's, I think it's 84 paper about the kind of primary assumptions of neuropsychology, and I forget which one it is. It's 3 or 4. Seems to be that was the target by the PDP people, and Berman and Plout still have some really nice models of how various things might evolve. So I think that kind of thing is a really good point. And what was I going to say about that? Yeah, Max was unreceptive because Max just doesn't like PDP, but I think for most, or it doesn't like connectionism generally. But yeah, I think that might be a good point. So within neuropsychology, there's often even still a question that you can push back about, the format of representation matters there, and some of the assumptions. Oftentimes the argument from double dissociation presupposes certain things about the representational format that often aren't made explicit. So yeah, I think that's right.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, and I don't really disagree with you. I disagree with one of the first or second slides you put up that had the guy from Google talking about successes of the method.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we can't put those slides up. So there was one where he talked about IBM Watson. Do you remember that on the slide? Do you remember what he said? Said something about how it works completely with statistical.
The IBM Watson that recently won on Jeopardy is thoroughly probabilistic and trained, while Boris Katz's Start is hybrid. So all systems use at least some statistical techniques.
So certainly it uses some statistical techniques, but I've read a whole slew of the research papers on Watson, and I've been following it because it's been misleading a lot of people, including a lot of investors. So recently, I don't know if you heard, but they thought they were going to apply it to, the claim there was that it could deal with unstructured text, and this was supposed to be a big leap. That it could read research papers and get stuff out. And so they thought that it had these great big benefits for medical. And they recently kind of given up on that, and the person who headed that up is leaving, and that's a huge, huge surprise to them. Now, I've read the papers on it, and there's actually a kind of a secret that's open secret. I mean, they've published that this is the case, is that the Jeopardy task was actually a very special task in the sense of what the world had out there for it to contribute to its ability to answer the questions. And that was that over 90%, over 92% of the answers to Jeopardy questions turned out to be Wikipedia titles. And so the way that Watson was very much advantaged by the work that was done by all these humans in putting together Wikipedia entries, which, as you know, have some sort of structure, but then also have just this huge amount of labor from humans targeted to answering these questions in a way that's specifically, you know, tailored to humans who are looking for that answer. And so it was very useful for playing Jeopardy. So the thing is that IBM Watson wasn't really doing, I mean, they may have started out with the goal of thinking it's going to deal with unstructured text, it's going to use these methods, and it used a lot of different methods. But the thing was that in reality, the shortcut thing was to start with, first check Wikipedia titles. And that gave it this huge jump start. And so even though, yes, it's using statistical methods and it's reading all this unstructured text and putting a structure on it and then testing it for consistencies and all sorts of things, it really couldn't do it without all the human labor of Wikipedia that's very finely tuned to the kinds of things that Jeopardy asks. So I just felt that I had to, as a public service announcement, with all these people here and all the misunderstanding. I mean, all these investors lost all this, or put all this money in based on the sort of misunderstanding that's been out there. And I don't want all these philosophers to be spending their labor on this misapprehension of what IBM Watson was able to achieve. So I do have a paper that explains this. I read all the research papers that IBM published in their special issue of their in-house journal about it, and I sort of distill it in a paper. So I just felt that if I'm allowed to talk, that I would make that comment and see how you responded. I don't know if it affects people's faith in these methods or not.
Sure. So sorry, just start. I can't see you and I can't recognize your voice. Who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Susan Sterrett. I got my PhD at Pitt, but then I was at Duke and Carnegie Mellon, and now I'm at Wichita State University.
Oh, okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so it's a good question. It raises a lot of interesting issues. There's similarly a nice paper by, I don't know if you know Jaron Lanier, I'm never sure if I'm saying his name right, but interesting as a kind of a lot of techno-critical stuff while still being very technically informed, talking about how a lot of the computer translation stuff similarly uses as input translations that have been done by humans, so it's piggybacking on a lot of that work. So on the one hand, some of this was just to say that a lot of statistical learning methods are more powerful than people used to think, and it kind of depends on the sorts of things you're learning. There is an interesting broader question. I mean, I'm happy to believe that Watson, the Jeopardy task always struck me as slightly odd to begin with. But one thing that's kind of interesting once you start thinking about learning is you think there's a lot of literature in the human case about the importance of scaffolding or niche construction or whatnot in the human learning case as well. So obviously, none of us learn to read just by being presented with random texts or having them laid around. Reading takes quite a lot of instruction, and in some sense, quite a structured environment. And more generally, I think if you've got a brain that's more, if you start thinking about the brain as more on the learning end than the innate knowledge end, the structure of the environment and self-structuring of the environment by humans plays a really important role. So, it is a fact, like it is a fact about Watson. It sounds like that it's a neat trick that it turns out Jeopardy and Wikipedia, the Wikipedia categories tend to line up so well, and that's actually lovely. And I guess when you say it that way, it's kind of fun.
Way, but
sorry.
I mean, you could say that it kind of proves your point in a way.
Yeah.
What data, what structures IBM had to work with made Watson be able to do many more things than it could do if it didn't have data.
Yeah, right. Right. So if there's a lot of structure in the world, and the whole point is extracting useful structure from the environment, then a very structured environment is going to be a lot easier than an unstructured environment, which also makes sense for if you start throwing unstructured text at Watson or something, it turns out not to be as good as you might have initially thought. I did hear about Watson and the medical imaging thing. I mean, that sounds like it was a failure on a number of levels, including overpromising. But yeah, I mean, I do think I should mention just in passing, I mean, there's a project that I'm part of here called Humanizing Machine Intelligence, which is thinking a lot about machine learning in public policy contexts. And of course, there's always a worry that so if you're doing things like deciding which prisoners to let out on parole or whose benefits to cut off, these are things where you often have a problem that you get bad data in and infer things that just kind of confirm people's prejudices. So I do think it's a really, like, this was not meant to be like super techno-optimistic or anything. I think there are real problems there, but the more general point that a lot of machine learning is very powerful, and it's powerful precisely because it uses the right kind of representational structure. That was the broad point. So.
Okay, thank you, Colin.
Thanks, everyone.